What is the crack, everyone? It is Nathan here, aka the Rambling Kern, and head instructor of Kern School of Combat. So, last week's video on the brief introduction to Irish archery throughout history was quite popular, so I'm basically going to make this a series and kind of continue through showing you different examples of the equipment used for archery in Ireland, as well as giving you an overview of the general history of archery in Ireland. And to me, it's a very fascinating one. Like I said, I've been doing archery since I was a child. I still do it very regularly, kind of 2 or 3 times a week, and has a special place in my heart. So it's kind of a topic that I'd love to discuss more and kind of show more. And if there's any kind of particular areas that you would like to know more about, please do let me know. I'd be more than happy to discuss them. So this week's going to be a brief overview of arrowheads throughout Irish history. So starting first is obviously Stone Age arrowheads. Now, as I discuss this, I'm going to bring these up on screen and show you them. So it's one of the interesting things in Ireland that we have a number of Stone Age arrowheads of various different types and various different etymologies, in other words, classifications, ones that kind of fall into specific shapes. The interesting thing with these is that there are some very elaborate and very difficult to make examples of these. So I've done a small bit of flint knapping. I'll show you an example of some of the work that I've done. Very difficult skill, and to see some of the examples that I've come across while doing research for this, you will see that some of these are actually very, at least from my basic understanding, are very difficult to do. So a lot of time and effort gone into them. As you slowly fast forward through the years, when you start to get into the Bronze Age, you still see stone arrowheads. This is, it makes total sense. You have a resource such as bronze, which is very expensive and difficult to make, so you're going to continue really using the cheap stone versions. However, you do still find bronze arrowheads, and I'll show an example of that, which is in a museum in Kerry, I believe. Now, the interesting thing in Ireland is around this time, archery slowly goes into decline. At this point, it was still very much being used primarily for hunting, but obviously still occasionally being used for war. But from what we can kind of gather, the majority of what was being done was being used for hunting. As we get into the Viking Age, that is when bows and archery itself goes through a complete new renaissance, and the Irish begin to adopt archery again. The Vikings themselves were avid archers. In fact, the Irish word boga comes from the Norse word for bow. So you can really see, even through the language, the impact that arrows have had on the Irish across this period. And interestingly, you will see around the Viking settlements such as Waterford and Dublin, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of arrows that have been found, and I'll show you some examples of those. Now, interestingly, with these arrowheads, a huge array of different types. And one thing that, for those of you who are new to arrows, that might be a little bit surprising to see, is that you have quite a range of socketed arrowheads. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we have kind of a basic target arrow like this, basic fletching, which are your feathers on the end, bound on with twine and glued on, and this is what I mean by socketed. So socketed just basically means the arrowhead sits over the piece of wood and sits onto it, and you have tanged arrowheads, which basically like a nail are driven down into it and then usually bound on for extra support. And this is something you see a lot of in the Viking Age, a lot of tanged arrowheads. Of course, you still see socketed heads, but you do see a very large number of tanged ones during this period. And as time goes on, these obviously start to go into decline. As to the reasons for that, I don't know. I think, just from the little bit of blacksmithing experience I have, that these would be a little bit easier to make and most likely require less material. So 2 potential reasons for something that may well get lost. which I think kind of speaks volumes for the amount of them that we've actually found. Arrows were in some ways kind of expected to be lost, so they were somewhat of a throwaway commodity. But interestingly, we don't see a huge amount of arrowheads found in Irish settlements from this time. We actually see very, very few. As far as I've seen in the records and from the research I've been able to do, you literally only have a handful of finds, not the hundreds of examples that you have within the Dublin settlements. Now, obviously, there were Irish people living, the Viking settlements such as Dublin. Now, obviously, there were Irish people living in these settlements, but that is really where you see the majority of arrowheads. As time progresses, when you start to get into the Norman period, this is when archery slowly is taking hold in Ireland, but still not quite as popular militarily as it is going to become. So as you start to move forward into this period, we see strongbow coming into Ireland. The majority of the troops he actually brings are archers, and they have a huge impact on the Irish through the war that he basically leads or has been essentially invited to take part in, but it's kind of a topic of its own. So one of the interesting things that we see with the arrows in this period is that they're basically very similar to the ones that we see in England, and this is where for myself actually researching these arrows and arrowheads of this time, basically anything past the Viking Age is quite difficult to research in Ireland, because either we have examples of it or there are examples but they are just simply not shown in the museums. So while we do have many finds of these, it's very difficult to get imagery to show you guys, but we do know from the archery being done in England, which was still very much the same as what was being done here, the examples that we have. So one of the interesting things that we start to see as we move forward is a lot of very specialized arrows being used, because militarily you have specific types of arrows that are useful for specific types of things. So the easiest way to explain that is, for hunting, you want an arrowhead with a large, wide head, because that will cause more bleeding. Whereas militarily, you want something with a very small, narrow head, because that's going to punch through a target such as chainmail or armor of various different types. And that's where we start to see a lot of specialized arrowheads, and especially moving forward, we start to see the prominence of bodkins on the battlefield. Interestingly, the very famous object Dürer picture of the Gallowglass in Kern, you actually see under the arm of the Gallowglass a number of different arrowheads tucked under his arm of all different types. The uses of these all very different, or very different depending on the situation, but it is interesting to see even at this period you see quite a different array of arrows. Now, as time starts to progress, archery becomes very much interlinked with the Irish and the Scots. So much so that when we go all the way forward to where musketry starts to become the prominent weapon on the battlefields in Europe, we still see a very high level of skill and also a huge number of archers being fielded by both Scottish and Irish armies. There's actually a few very famous examples which I originally had thought were actually of Scottish soldiers, and they're actually of Irish soldiers in the Swedish 30-year war. There's 10 examples of drawings of these archers, and of those 10 I believe it's something like 7 of them are holding bows, which I think is fascinating, and it also really shows how popular archery was amongst the Irish and Scottish communities of that time. And the impact, especially the Scottish had in Ireland with archery around this time, is also fascinating, but I think that's a video of its own and definitely deserves some special attention. So while this is a very brief overview and covers literally millennia, I just wanted to kind of give you an introduction to the sort of arrowheads that you would expect to have seen. Like I said, once we get past the Viking period and into the medieval and Renaissance period, it gets a little bit more difficult for me to find imagery to show you guys. I do hope one day to maybe get into the museum and actually just take some images of arrowheads of those periods, because I find they're very poorly documented. no, I shouldn't say poorly documented. There was very good documentation of them, but very little imagery. I think probably the main reason for that is because a lot of the arrows of the time simply just all look the same. Whether you be in England or mainland Europe or in Ireland, a lot of the arrows and arrowheads, I should say, are very, very similar. Once we get into this later period, especially the Tudor period, you do see very specific types of arrowheads. I mean, the Tudor bodkin being a very famous example. Short, stout, bodkin, which is basically named after a needle, so very much like almost like a nail for punching through various different types of armour. Now, like I said, I know I've covered a huge range of time here, but the main reason I wanted to do this was just to give you a brief introduction to arrows and various different arrow types. Like I said, you have all the way back to the Stone Age, so you have the likes of this wonderful example sent to me by my friend Ernest, which is a flint example, as you can see, knapped from a single piece, like our early Stone Age types. And these ones would have been sat into a socket and bound on. This is how many of the early Stone Age arrows would have been produced and how they would have looked, as you would have seen from some of the examples that I've shown. And then as the period progresses, we move into bronze, we move into iron, we move into steel. So this was mainly just to give you an introduction to these different sort of arrows that you would have expected to see, different arrowheads. Interestingly, and this is going to be a completely different video and a completely different topic, but I want to do some weapon tests on this. I do think that there was actually numerous arrows misclassified in Ireland. And what I mean by that is the Irish, as you've seen in some of my work, were very much fans of using war darts. Essentially a oversized arrow or an undersized javelin. Now you have arrowheads, or there we go. I do have war dart heads. I just have to shaft them and actually test them. That will be coming very soon. But I think there are a few misclassifications that are just simply passed off as being arrows. So that's a topic of its own. I do think a very fascinating kind of section of history that I really think is just completely ignored. Very much people tend to focus on English archery, and I think Irish and Scottish and just the Gaelic world in general has its own kind of very unique and fascinating form of archery and archery traditions and history, and that's something that I kind of want to touch on. So I really do hope you've enjoyed this. We're closing in on that 1,000 subscriber mark, so please do share the videos. If you don't already, please subscribe. It really does help. And once I reach that 1,000 mark, it will really help me start to be able to spend the time to make more videos, more in-depth videos, and do more things out in the wild, and more field tests and weapon tests, which I know are really what everyone enjoys. So once again, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe, and slán.